but rather he simply says, I know this to be true. And he does have a number of what we would call visions over time. And these visions are the source of much of his work. When we look at Schelling, though, what we then see is taking this fundamental revelation and arguing within a philosophical, and Schelling says a scientific tradition, why this must be the case. And the most important triumph of Schelling's engagement with Böhme comes in the essay, what we call the freedom essay, on the being of human freedom. And in this he argues that freedom consists of the possibility to do good or evil. To this may seem more or less obvious to us, because in many ways this is the way that we think of freedom. Freedom is always freedom of choice. Am I going to have the ham sandwich or am I going to have the turkey sandwich? Am I going to beat my wife or am I going to not beat my wife? Those are simply choices, and I simply choose one or the other. And I do good when I choose good, and I do evil when I choose evil. And both are aspects of my freedom. But within German philosophy, and philosophy generally up to this point, freedom is understood in a much more limited way. And I think the best way to understand this is by looking at Kant and Kant's conception of freedom. Kant says freedom is autonomy, giving the law to oneself. That is to say, my actions are dictated by nothing outside of me, including my body. So when I go have another cigarette because my body desires it, that's not freedom. That's being determined by something outside of me. That's being heteronomous. When I simply go with the flow, when I'm simply determined by what society tells me to do, I'm not free. I'm not choosing something. I'm simply determined in advance. When I choose something that is irrational, when I choose something that I'm simply inclined to by my bodily desires, by my passions, I'm not free. I'm controlled by my desires. The only time that I'm free is when I act in accordance with my rational duty. And this is the tradition against which Schelling is responding, and he uses Böhme's idea as a way to think this. So freedom then is the freedom to do good or evil. But evil is always a problem for traditional philosophical and theological thinking, because we have what I call the triangle of evil. You've got God's omnibenevolence. God is purely and totally good. You've got God's universal creatorship. He created all things. And you've got the existence of evil. Problem is, you can't sustain all three. Because if God is perfectly good and is the creator of all things, where does evil come from? If there's evil and God is universally benevolent, then somebody else must have created evil. If God is the universal creator and there is evil in the world, then God can't be universally good. He must have evil within him. And this is the problem that Schelling sets out to solve and deploys Böhme in order to do it. And it comes from this idea of the Ungrund. It comes from this idea of the abyss, which Schelling calls the will of the basis. That which is God, but is within God, but is not God. It's God understood as the ground for his existence. And the metaphor that I like to use for this idea of the ground, and I'll actually use the marker for just a second, is to think of a ray, put it in mathematical terms. And the ground of the ray is a point. That's the start. It's where the ray emerges from. But this is not the ray. It's in fact precisely the opposite of the ray. It's what's overcome in the ray. It's what is negated in the ray. But it's still part of the ray. So we have this thing that is an absolute negation of its origin in order for it to come into being. And so Schelling states that the basis of God is this desire, this want, this darkness, this lack. And when God comes into being, when God is existent, it's as a negation of that. It's an overcoming of that want. It's an overcoming of that lack. But that lack has to come first. God overcomes that lack and moves on. But we as human beings sometimes turn back to that lack. We want to go backwards. We want to assert ourselves over the will of the system. And it's when we desire to go back that evil comes into the world. So evil then has its source in something that is in God but is not God. And so this is Schelling's way of using Böhme to solve this problem of evil and to solve the problem of freedom. Other influences, George Rapp was part of the harmonist tradition. Martin Heidegger was profoundly influenced by both Schelling and Böhme. So what we see is this bizarre revelatory doctrine becomes part of a philosophical tradition as well as part of a mystical tradition. And so when we fuse these together, when we see these two as linked, it finds itself squarely in our toolbox as Gnostics, because this is precisely the realm in which we find ourselves, where we take seriously both revelatory doctrine, revelatory information, revelatory knowledge, Gnostic knowledge, but without dismissing rational knowledge, without dismissing argumentation, without dismissing the scientific inquiry. In fact, we seek to understand that which we know by faith. And this is an Augustinian idea, but one that would be definitely part of Böhme's own systematic thinking. So this is just a very, very brief, very, very tip of the iceberg introduction to some of the ideas that are important in Böhme's thinking, and showing the way that Böhme has an influence over a wide variety of philosophical and theological ideas, and should be, I hope, an introduction into why Böhme is important for us, specifically as Gnostics, and especially within the AJC. So that's all I wanted to say about Böhme. So this is very, very quick and dirty, as I said, but I want to open it up to some questions.
How do the philosophers within this kind of system view, I believe, in terms of determinism, fate versus free will?
Well, it's an interesting question, because this is precisely one of the things that Schelling takes up. And I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of Schelling, just because it's more familiar, but he is drawing explicitly on Böhme. You can look at some of these texts and you just see even the language in many cases is absolutely identical. When we look at the world as a rational construct, we have to afford a place for determination, for cause and effect, for the fact that there are material things that impinge on our being. If you throw me off the top of a building, I'm going to fall. I can't decide not to. That's not within the realm of my freedom. But what is within the realm of my freedom, what my freedom consists of, is the way that I approach the world, my attentiveness to the world, and my attentiveness to my engagement with it. And it's that movement of freedom that is going to be most important for somebody like Böhme or Schelling. Böhme is not going to dismiss the external world. Neither are other Lutheran thinkers. But at the same time, free will is going to take on an extraordinary, extraordinary power for them. They do want to invest an extraordinary power in human freedom, because it is through human freedom, and even one might argue through the choice of evil, through the freedom to act evilly, that we build up the Godhead. that we come to the
So is there-
emergence of Godhead.
Is there a possibility, therefore, of universal salvation or